Welcome to Thursday Bible study. I'm not quite sure how many people are aware of this, so I'm not sure whether it's worth waiting for people to turn up or just sort of assume that people are going to be watching via catch up. So either way, welcome, whatever time of the day or week you happen to be watching this. As you possibly know, we are currently working through a series on Jacob, and we have got up to chapter 37, which is the beginning of the tale of Joseph. And it's a pretty long passage, to be honest. So what I thought I would focus on in this study is, well, basically I gave it the title being the favourite versus being chosen. So the story of Joseph certainly begins with a tale of favouritism, and I want us to consider to what extent Jacob's favouritism of Joseph can be projected onto God, in which to what extent Jacob's treatment of Joseph can be seen as a model of how God treats his children. So anyway, we're in chapter 37, right at the start of chapter 37, and it says here, now Israel, that's another word for Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. So that's the coat of many colours, the Technicolor dream coat that he's famous for. And then it goes on to say, Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, and he brought their father a bad report about them. So when we read about Joseph being Jacob's favourite, it's easy to understand his brother's negative reaction towards him. So he didn't carry his status as the favourite with humility and self-deprecation. No, I think it's fair to say that Joseph was spoilt, he was arrogant, and he was a telltale. And nobody likes a telltale, right? And then Joseph goes on to tell his whole family about two dreams that he has had, which basically show them bowing down to him. So it's no wonder that the Bible later says they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. So he was not a popular guy, Joseph. And I can relate to their reaction a little bit, because as a firstborn son, I was intensely jealous of my little brother, who's 2.5 years younger than me. And I often felt that he received attention that I should have got, right? So even when he was still a baby, I would often bite him quite severely, and it would leave terrible marks on his body, and I feel awful about it now. But at the time, I was just consumed with this jealousy. How could he receive this attention, which I believe that I deserve? So how are we to read this story today? Now, because we know how the story ends, right, it's easy to think that this favouritism, Jacob's favouritism towards Joseph, was somehow God's will. So just as Joseph was Jacob's favourite, so Joseph was God's favourite, right? And Joseph was always in the right, because, of course, his dreams do come to pass. His family members do end up kind of bowing down to him when he's sort of Pharaoh's right-hand man. So we could say, well, in that case, that sort of vindicates his entire behaviour over all these years. And I'm reminded of the song in the musical Joseph, when Joseph has been sold as a slave. It's Poor Joseph, what you gonna do? Things look bad for you, hey, what you gonna do? So it's this, oh, poor Joseph, he's the victim, he's done everything right, and yet still he's been so mistreated. And so there's this tendency to project it onto God. That just like Jacob had his favourite, that God also has favourites. So some believe that God is meritocratic. In other words, he rewards us for doing the right thing. He shows favour to those who follow the rules. And whereas on the other side, there are people who think that God's favour is completely random. Think of certain expressions of Calvinism. You're either one of the lucky ones or you're not. But either way, this view of God leaves a lot of outsiders, a lot of rejects who can do very little about their status. They're either simply not good enough or they're unlucky. So is that really what our God is like? Is he a God who shows favoritism? But I'll tell you why I think that Jacob's treatment of Joseph, so Jacob's favoritism towards Joseph, is not a reflection of God's nature, and therefore not a model of behaviour for us as a church. It's because Jacob has a track record of showing favoritism which leads to jealousy and division. As we've already seen, Jacob had 2 wives, right, which is never a good start. His 2 wives, Rachel and Leah. And in Genesis 29 it says, his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah. You'd have thought he would have learnt from this experience, but he was a creature of habit, was Jacob. And then it says, when the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive. So God shows compassion towards the unloved one. He doesn't show understanding towards Jacob and say, well, yeah, you're absolutely right to have favourites. No, he shows compassion to the wife who was not loved, who was not the favourite. And then in Genesis 30 it says, when Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she became jealous of her sister. So just as Joseph's brothers showed jealousy towards him, Rachel became jealous towards Leah, the other wife. So that's what favoritism leads to. And Jacob was a serial favoritism shower. So what do we mean by favoritism anyway? Well, my definition, I suppose, is favoritism is preferential treatment. It's showing love to one but not the other. This is not godly behaviour. And just to prove that to you, through various Bible verses, there are more, so I'm just going to pick out a selection. There's one in Leviticus chapter 19 verse 15. Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbour fairly. That's interesting. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that God prefers the poor or God shows favour to the poor, but in terms of justice, it's very clear that we should not, as humans, we should not show favouritism neither to the poor nor to the rich and the great. And then in Acts 10:34 it says, then Peter began to speak. I now realise how true it is that God does not show favouritism. And Ephesians 6 verse 9, and masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favouritism with him. And finally, James 2 verse 9, but if you show favouritism, you sin and are convicted by the law as lawbreakers. Pretty clear words. Now you could say, of course, that there seems to be more of a sort of a New Testament weighting there. So most of these verses actually about God not showing favoritism are in the New Testament. So could you say, well, maybe that's part of the new covenant? Has this somehow sort of evolved? Did God show more favoritism in the Old Testament? There does seem to be a few sort of hints in that direction. Because we obviously do read in the Old Testament in various places that God chose one over another, right? So how does this work? Well, when we think of biblical favoritism, we often think of the favored child, if you like, the sense of the firstborn son as being the chosen one, which was and is the Jewish custom. The firstborn son originally would have been dedicated to God and was actually intended to serve as a priest in the temple. The firstborn was heir and would thus inherit a double portion of his father's land and property, and he would very often carry on the father's business. So when you think about it, this seems terribly unfair towards the other siblings, right? So even if the firstborn was fully deserving of this reward, there was nothing the others could do to somehow make themselves more worthy. But this is a human tradition and not a godly one. God, as we know, will choose whomever he pleases. If we look at the story of the patriarchs, we often find anomalies in terms of which son was favoured by God. So let's just look at Adam. His firstborn son was Cain, and yet Abel was the son favoured by God. Abraham, his firstborn, though perhaps not legitimately, was Ishmael, and yet his second son, Isaac, was favoured by God. Isaac, his firstborn, was Esau, yet Jacob was the one favoured by God. Jacob, his firstborn, was Reuben, but Joseph was favoured, and later you could even say that Judah was favoured. And finally we've got Jesse, where David, his youngest son, was the one favoured by God. And as we remember, Saul was the one favoured by the people, and yet there was no favour of God upon his life. But I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, yeah, but is this still a contradiction? Because if we say that God doesn't show favoritism, surely those are all examples of God choosing one over another. So how do we reconcile those two things? Well, I suppose what's interesting is that it's actually pretty difficult to discern a clear pattern among these chosen ones. So Abel and David, for example, were chosen on merit. On, for example, the quality of their sacrifice or the state of their heart, right? But Jacob doesn't appear to have been particularly honest. Quite the opposite, actually. He wasn't particularly upstanding, right? And Joseph, while he did have integrity, as we've seen, he was a pretty annoying guy a lot of the time, not particularly likable. So it's interesting to follow the lineage of the chosen and the favoured ones in the book of Genesis, because from Exodus onwards, it's no longer about individuals. It's about Israel, the people of God as a community. And then from the New Testament onwards, it's about the church. They are God's chosen. So Hebrews 12 from verse 18 is a wonderful description, and it explains how the physical old covenant has now become a spiritual new covenant. And it says, but you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. You have come to thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly, to the church of the firstborn whose names are written in heaven. So right from the start, God broke the rules. His understanding of the firstborn is a spiritual and not a physical one, just as God sees circumcision of the heart as far more important than physical bodily circumcision. That's why you can't be born a Christian. You can't live in a Christian country. It doesn't matter who you are or what your circumstances. God looks at your heart, and that's what counts. So as the Church of Jesus Christ, we are firstborn heirs. Regardless of our earthly status, God speaks a new identity and sense of belonging over us. So remember, in Deuteronomy 7 verse 6, it says, "For you are a people holy to the Lord your God," speaking of Israel. "The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession." And then, as we know, this calling in a sense is transferred over to the church in the New Testament. And in 1 Peter it then says, "But you are a chosen people," speaking to the church, "a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light." So if we look at Israel, the people of Israel and the church, God's method of choosing appears relatively random. So what's so special about any of them or any of us? Right? Why would God choose us? And I think over the years, both these groups have fallen into a similar trap that Joseph did. Because Joseph was the chosen one, the favoured one, he thought that was because he was something special and he lorded it over others. However, we need to come to realise that God chooses. Now, this is kind of the crux of the matter. This is the key point that I want to make today. God chooses based on the calling placed upon a person's or a people's life, not on merit. God chooses based on his plans and purposes for that person or people. So it's less to do with the person or people themselves and far more to do with the calling that God has placed on that person or that people's lives. So the question we need to ask, well, when God chooses a person or a people, is that favoritism in the sense that we looked at before, this sense of being preferred, this sense of being, if you like, mollycoddled or wrapped up in cotton wool, protected from everything else, set apart, and then given this preferential treatment? Well, we only have to look at the people that God has chosen. Were these people the spoilt ones, the ones living in the lap of luxury, with the rest acting as their slaves? Clearly not. You might be familiar with the Peter Parker principle. The Peter Parker principle, a bit of a tongue twister. With great power comes great responsibility. And the same is true of those chosen by God. This is my second key point. Listen carefully. So to be chosen does not mean to be preferred. You are not the winner among losers. We are not saved from the world. We are saved for the world. For to be God's chosen one does not mean a life cut off and protected from the dangers of the world. Quite the opposite. To be God's chosen means to be a light to the world and potentially to lead a life subject to greater danger and greater suffering than that of others. And this should humble us as it humbled Joseph, right? We often believe that God chooses those who are better, more gifted, more better looking, more successful, clever, or well behaved. And while holiness is attractive to God, he uses us in spite of who we are, not just because of it. And as we've said before, Joseph was spoiled, arrogant, not a team player. In fact, apart from his prophetic gifting, the only real discernible quality is his integrity, and you have to give him that. But he has a huge calling placed on his life. But the fulfillment of that calling, the calling on Joseph, does not come to pass until he has suffered and he's been tested in a variety of areas. He's separated from his father, betrayed by his brothers, stripped of his status and his finery. He's humiliated. His integrity is called into question. He's falsely accused and imprisoned, forgotten by those he helped. And only then does God show himself faithful and raise him up to be a saviour. Who does that remind you of? The wonderful thing about the story of Joseph is that he is a type of Christ figure, a foretaste of the Messiah to come, so that when the Messiah finally arrives, his life resonates so much more deeply with those he is among. There's a sense of familiarity. So I just want to ask us, how often have we looked at others and reacted jealously, like Joseph's brothers? I know I have many times in the church. And perhaps we've thought that God has showed favouritism towards other brothers and sisters in Christ. Perhaps we think that we've been overlooked, that we've been unfairly treated. And perhaps we've acted jealously towards others, or we've, if you like, got stroppy at church leaders because we think we somehow should have been chosen or seen. But consider this: if God has chosen someone, if God has shown favour towards them, he's raised them up, then usually because he has called them to suffer. I'll say it again: if God has shown favour to someone, if God has raised somebody up, then usually because he has called them to suffer. They have either suffered or will suffer or are suffering for the sake of this call. And God has raised them up not for their sake. God does not raise people up for their sake, but for our sakes, for your sake. For the sake of the world whom he loves and wants to draw to himself. So if that's favouritism, then it's kingdom favouritism. It's favouritism God style. I hope that helped. Have a great evening, or whatever you're doing. God bless, and see you soon. Goodbye.